Welcome, 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 everyone. Welcome to the Freedom School. This event is sponsored by the Department of Africana Studies at Georgia State University and supported by Auburn Avenue Research Library. We thank them so much for all of their help in managing these events. This evening, we are delighted to have Brittany Pradere with us. Brittany graduated from our master's program in Africana Studies in 1920. Correct, Brittany?
Last spring, so 2021.
2021, okay. And Brittany is going to be presenting the results of her thesis research. And I'm happy to moderate this panel as I was Brittany's thesis advisor. So I'm super happy for her to be able to share her work with you. So by way of introduction, I want to let you know that Brittany is first generation born in the US. And she is going to be, as I said, talking about the results of her research, which is about migration from Haiti. So I'm just going to share a brief excerpt. Hopefully I don't steal your thunder. I'm going to share a brief excerpt from your the abstract in your thesis. Brittany says, migration from Haiti is driven by a variety of factors, including violence, poverty, and politics. Many Haitians migrate to the United States to escape the challenges they face in their home country and for the opportunity to create a better life for themselves and their families. Unfortunately, one's migration experience is highly influenced by their level of privilege and access, and migrants from Haiti face particularly unique challenges in their attempts to relocate to the United States. This study uses the narrative interviews of 8 Haitian migrants to explore the influence of marginalized intersecting identities on their experiences regarding migrating to and living in the United States. There is a limited amount of research that has been done on this population sample, leaving many gaps in the literature. The research questions that are guiding this study are as follows. 1, what motivates Haitian migrants to relocate to the United States? 2, how does the intersection of class, race, gender, immigration status, ability, and ethnicity affect Haitian migrants' experiences, both migrating to and living in the United States? This research is relevant to the field of Africana studies because it expands the literature and offers an innovative contribution. Additionally, migration is a human rights issue that affects the entire diaspora. So with that said, this is a very timely topic. I mean, it always has been, but especially in light of recent events in Haiti. So we're definitely going to raise some of those questions at the end. So without further ado, Brittany Pradere, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis, for that beautiful introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see this okay? Okay, awesome. So good evening, everyone. My name is Brittany Pradere, as Dr. Davis stated, and I am a recent graduate of the Africana Studies Department as of last spring. And as she mentioned, my research focused on the experiences of Haitian migrants in the US, and that research will frame our conversation for today. So today we will be discussing and learning about Black migrants and human rights. I will be talking about how my specific study can be used as a sort of case study to exemplify how these concepts apply to Black migrants and migration as a whole. This conversation in this study was initially inspired by my grandmother. She came to the US from Haiti as an economic migrant in the 70s, and she worked as a maid in the homes of rich families in upstate New York to care for her own family. And so this conversation is also inspired by Black migrants who face deportation, torture, racism, xenophobia, and a violation of their human rights every day, as we have recently seen in what has happened with the Haitians in Del Rio, Texas. I want to take a minute to note about my terminology. I will be using both immigrant and migrant in this presentation. I'm using immigrant to describe people who moved to America permanently, And I'm using migrant to describe any type of movement between borders. And then finally, I want to make a note about land. So in a conversation about immigration and migrants, it's important to acknowledge that this land was stolen from indigenous people before any of us migrated here, either willingly or forcibly as a result of chattel slavery. So I want you all to listen to the following words: immigrant, migrant, alien, foreign, illegal, undocumented, unauthorized, permanent resident, citizen. As you hear these words, who comes to mind? What do you see and why? The media, history, and our personal experiences shape who and what we view as other, as alien, as foreign, and as citizen. We've been programmed to culturally and phenotypically identify who belongs and who doesn't, who is in and who is out. So we will begin by discussing why migrants relocate. Migrants emigrate from their countries for a variety of reasons, and migration in general is driven by what is known as push factors and pull factors. So push factors are factors that push migrants to move voluntarily, and in some cases, they can be at risk if they stay. So push factors may include lack of jobs, poverty, civil strife, war, political and religious persecution, and environmental issues. Whereas pull factors, on the other hand, are factors that pull migrants to the destination or host country. And so they attract the individual to leave their home. Pull factors may include higher standards of living, higher wages, labor demand, or political and religious freedom. It's also important to note that push factors and pull factors don't occur in a vacuum. They're usually oftentimes a result of colonialism or neo-colonial or neo-imperial dynamics. So while countries may have formal independence, their economic and political systems can still be determined by outside nations. And Haiti is a clear example of this concept. Foreign colonial and neo-colonial nations like France and the United States have interfered on the island socially, politically, and economically. And they've enacted policies in Haiti that have been to the detriment of Haitian citizens while benefiting US or French or European citizens. And so this dynamic forces migration as well. Migration discourse in the United States tends to focus more on the southern border. However, Black migrants make up a significant portion of our migrant population. After the end of slavery, Black migration in the US halted for about 150 years due to national quotas and also the racism experienced by Black people in the United States. So what exactly were national quotas? Well, in the 1880s, restrictions began to be employed on immigration in the United States. And by the 1920s, quotas were set for the number of immigrants that could be accepted each year. European migrants were given preferential treatment in this system. So the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, as you can see here, was created to restrict immigration based on nationality. And it utilized quotas based on 2% of the foreign-born individuals of that nationality on the 1890 census with a minimum quota of 100. And Cohn writes, as a result, the law favored migration from Northern and Western European countries with longer histories of migration to the US. So what does this mean? And why did they use the 1890 census, even though the law was passed in 1924? So basically, they decided to use the 1890 census because, to keep it simple, it was more white. And the US was intentionally trying to favor white migrants in order to keep their population as white as possible. And so if we look at this chart, we see that Great Britain was allowed a quota of 65,000 migrants or immigrants per year, whereas countries like Egypt or Ethiopia were only allowed 100. So you have a country like Great Britain where we can have 65,000 people come and live in the United States, whereas Egypt and Ethiopia could only have 100 as a cap. And so this severely limited the incoming of Black migrants into the country. However, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 repealed these quotas. The Refugee Act of 1980 and the Immigration Act of 1990 allowed for a wider variety of immigrants and led to the modern wave of Black immigrants in the US today. So today there's about 3.8 million Black immigrants living in the United States, and Black immigrants account for 8.7% of the nation's Black population, which is nearly triple their share in 1980. Next, we will discuss pathways to entry, permanent residence, and citizenship. And so entering the US involves an entry process. The documentation and passport necessities depend on the country you're arriving from and your citizenship status. Documentation includes specific visa types, as well as ensuring that your passport is not set to expire within the 6-month period of the date of travel. The purpose of travel, in addition to other factors, determine the necessary visa type under US immigration law. And so visa applicants must meet all these visa requirements in order to qualify. And there are both non-immigrant and immigrant visas. Non-immigrant visas are temporary. So this would be if someone would like to come to the US for vacation, for work, just a temporary stay. Whereas immigrant visas are for people who plan on living in the United States permanently. The United States Department of Homeland Security defines the unauthorized resident immigrant population as all foreign-born non-citizens who are not residents. And so when foreign nationals enter the US in violation of US immigration law, it's considered illegal immigration. And so that's another form of entry, is illegal entry. And some ways that people can do this is border crossing or visa overstay, which would mean that you come on a temporary visa, like a vacation visa, and then you stay here permanently. Immigrants that desire to live in the United States must first become lawful permanent residents. So those seeking permanent residence must have someone file a petition for them. And then immigrants must be eligible under one of the following categories: green card through family, green card through employment, green card as a special immigrant, green card through refugee status, green card for human trafficking and crime victims, green card for victims of abuse, green card through other categories, and green card through registry. If the applicant is accepted, the green card will be valid for 10 years. Applicants can be denied a green card if they are found inadmissible, and the wait time for green cards tend to range from 3 to 25 years. And so if the person who is a permanent resident would then like to have citizenship, they have to have resided in the US for 5 years. They have tests on English language proficiency, US history, government, and constitution. And then they must take an oath of allegiance to the United States, to their home country. So while there are a variety of pathways to entry, permanent residence, and citizenship, many of these are inaccessible due to pricing and require documentation. So if we're keeping Haiti as an example, today a non-immigrant, so just a temporary vacation visa in Haiti, is about $160 US. This may not sound like a lot of money. However, Haiti is one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, and the annual per capita income for Haitians is $450 US. So that means it would take about 1/3 of their annual income to afford the fees to apply for a visa to come to the US. And that's just for the application. So after spending that amount of money, there's no guarantee that the visa request will even be approved. And oftentimes it's denied. And so because of these obstacles, Haitian migrants and Black migrants in general have continuously used non-traditional and often illegal methods to forge a pathway to first world nations like the US, Canada, and European countries. And so when we're having conversations about migration and people say, oh, just do it the right way, wait your turn, migrate the right way, we're talking about a process that's inaccessible for so many people, whether it's because length of time, because remember I said the wait for a green card can be as little as 3 years, but it can be as much as 25 years. And if you're in a dire or desperate situation, who's gonna wait 25 years? And then if you don't have the money to even apply for a visa, that limits your options as well. And so when we see people use illegal methods of entry, it's because they didn't have any other choice oftentimes. Next, we will talk about sentiments in the US towards migrants and in general. So when white people are immigrating to the US, it was and still is encouraged. Highly educated and elite immigrants are encouraged to come as well. However, when it comes to Black and brown migrants, migrants who are have less education or who are like day laborers or people who work with their hands, there have been restrictions on this type of immigration. The 1990s featured debates surrounding the relationship of immigrants and their children to US educational, welfare, and political systems, and whether the immigration system served US national interest as a whole. And since then, the immigration debate has centered on preventing the entry of terrorists and also controlling the unauthorized migration population. And so for Haitian migrants specifically, the historical precedents of racism and xenophobia prevail in terms of sentiment. For example, in January of 2018, President Trump was quoted in an immigration meeting referring to the nation of Haiti as well as other African and Latin American nations as S-whole countries. The president singled out Haiti specifically, telling lawmakers that Haitian immigrants must be left out of any deal, remarking, "Why do we need more Haitians? Take them out." President Trump suggested that the United States should instead bring more people from countries such as Norway instead, and you can guess why. Their race is a critical factor in this discrimination, and many migrants filed a lawsuit stating that Trump's rhetoric demonstrates that his administration's immigration policies were motivated by bigotry rather than policy concerns. President Trump's rhetoric is not an isolated occurrence. Haitian migrants in the US have faced explicit xenophobia historically. Foreman writes, "As more Haitian refugees entered the US, many negative stereotypes were appended upon them. In the 1980s, Haitians were designated as a primary group at risk for AIDS, and even after their removal from this list, the FDA still refused blood donations from Haitians." Foreman describes how irrational fears of acquiring the HIV virus through casual contact with Haitians fueled anti-Haitian feelings among the larger US population. These anti-Haitian feelings led to dehumanizing treatment. For example, 89 HIV-positive Haitian refugees were pushed off the Coast Guard cutter with a fire hose to avoid contact when returned to Haiti. This image is a protest that occurred in New York in 1990, where Haitians gathered to fight back against the stigma that had been placed upon them regarding the AIDS epidemic. And then most recently, there has been an intense focus on the Haitian migrants in Del Rio, Texas. This is another example of how xenophobic and racist sentiment impacts the experiences of Black migrants in general and Haitian migrants specifically. So while President Biden has repealed some Trump-era immigration policies, he has kept some controversial ones, including Title 42, which has been recently used to expel Haitian nationals. Title 42 allows the government to prevent the introduction of individuals during certain public health emergencies, such as the pandemic that we're currently living under. Haiti has suffered from the assassination of its president, hurricanes, earthquakes, gang violence, and economic stagnation. And so these refugees absolutely have a right to claim for asylum. However, as you can see, they have been treated with such a level of disregard and disrespect that historically we don't see happen to white migrants or white refugees. So now that we have some general background information, I want to move into talking about my actual study. It explored the experiences of Haitian migrants in order to identify why they choose to migrate to the United States, as well as if race, nationality, class, ability, immigration status, and gender impact their experiences with migrating to and living in the United States. The research questions that were guiding my study were as follows. Number one, what motivates Haitian migrants to relocate to the United States? And number two, how does the intersection of class, race, gender, immigration status, ability, and nationality affect Haitian migrants' experiences, both migrating to and living in the United States? The theoretical frameworks guiding my study were critical race theory and a human rights framework. This study utilizes critical race theory to examine racial power structures within the immigration system in the United States and how these power structures impact the migration experiences of Haitian immigrants. The study utilizes a human rights framework as well, because migrants have a propensity to be especially vulnerable to discrimination. The lack of migration governance contributes to the consistent violation of migrant rights, and because the human rights of every single global citizen, including migrants, must be honored and protected at all times. Next, I will briefly discuss the methodology of the study. In terms of my methodology, a narrative approach was chosen. The design strategy for this qualitative study is purposeful sampling. The criteria necessary to participate: you must have been between the ages of 18 and 89. You must have identified as Black. You must have been born in Haiti, and you must have migrated to the United States. You had to have been willing to speak freely about your migration experiences. You had to have been available for direct contact and clarification regarding data. And you had to have internet or phone connection for distant interviews, because this was done during the COVID-19 pandemic. The voluntary nature of the study, as well as expectations of confidentiality, were explained at the start. And as mandated by the Human Subjects Office, participants were provided with informed consent regarding the purpose of the research, procedures, risks and benefits, confidentiality, and withdrawal of participation. All right, so next we would discuss the results of my study. So my study had 8 participants. Their ages ranged from 42 to 63. They were all from one of 4 cities in Haiti: Port-au-Prince, Léogâne, Fort Liberté, or Port Margot. They all currently live in either Georgia, Massachusetts, or Rhode Island. 4 of the participants were women and 4 of the participants were men. All participants identified as cisgender and straight. All participants identified as Christian. The participants had varying levels of education, ranging from some high school to doctorate level. Participants had a variety of occupations. However, most were in the healthcare field. There was 1 store clerk and 1 immigration lawyer. All the participants have been in the US for at least 26 years and at most 38 years. 5 of the participants came legally via family reunification channels. 2 participants came on tourist visas and overstayed, and 1 participant came by boat. I want to go a little bit more in depth about each participant, because I really believe that telling the stories of Black migrants is so important in terms of highlighting their experiences as a means of demanding change. When we have record of what people have been through when it comes to coming to America and trying to make a better life for themselves, it really does create a significant impact when we are fighting for changes in our immigration laws. And so I will start with Samuel. He's from Port-au-Prince, Haiti. He lived with his father, stepmom, and 6 other siblings. His birth mother moved to the US when he was 6. He attended private schools and speaks fluent French. He got a visa to the US when he was 18, and he would travel back and forth. He eventually stayed long-term. He remained in the US underdocumented until he received permanent residence. Next, we have Joseph. He is from Léogâne. He migrated to the US by boat in the early 1990s. He was arrested immediately upon arrival and was transported to Miami for deportation. He was put in a hotel for holding when flights back to Haiti were delayed. While he was in the hotel, he jumped from a 3rd-story window and just ran. He was eventually able to find other Haitians who were able to connect him to his family, and he was able to settle in. He lived here undocumented for years. He later had false documentation until the year 2000, when he was granted amnesty. He originally had no intention of applying for US citizenship, but he recently filed after 30 years of living in the country. Next, we have Ronald. He's from Fort Liberté. His father lived in the US and as an American citizen for most of his childhood and teenage years. His grandfather was Dominican, so growing up, he would spend his summers in the Dominican Republic. His father applied for permanent residence for both him and his sister. He moved to the United States, specifically Florida, in 1995 when he was 16 years old. He experienced bullying and difficulty learning the language. He applied for and received US citizenship in his late 20s. Next, we have Emmanuel. Emmanuel is from Port-au-Prince. His father worked as a government official in the Duvalier government. He had access to higher levels of private education and resources growing up. His family faced political persecution for their association with the Duvalier government once it fell. And so he and his siblings were sent to live with their uncle in Miami, Florida. His father died soon after, and so he decided not to return to Haiti. Because he came to the US on a tourist visa, he stayed after its expiration. After a few months, he moved to Brooklyn, New York, where he lived for 20 years. And this was the one participant whose current citizenship status is unclear. Next, we have Darlene. She's from Port-au-Prince. Her parents migrated to America in 1973. She and her two siblings lived with their aunt while their parents were in America. By 1981, when she was 15 years old, her parents were able to secure legal residence, and she and her siblings were able to join them in the US. And so this was 7 years that she went without seeing her parents. She experienced violent xenophobia in her high school, including days where other students would plan to beat up Haitians. After she was married, she applied for and received US citizenship in 1994 at the age of 28. Next, we have Esther. She's from Leogon as well. Her father lived in the US her whole life. She is a deaf woman. She attended a school for the deaf in Haiti. There's a severe lack of opportunities and resources for the deaf community in Haiti. So after completing school, she decided it would be best to move to the United States. By 1994, she was granted permanent residence through her father's petitioning. And then she made the move to the US. And then by 1999, she became a US citizen. Next, we have Fabiola. She's from Port Margot. She lived with 6 siblings and her mother. Her father lived in the US since she was 3 years old. Her father applied for permanent residency for her and her siblings. Her mother was not able to migrate until about 3 or 4 years later due to issues with her paperwork. After graduating high school, she went to college where she applied for and received US citizenship. She continued on to receive her JD or her law degree and is now a practicing immigration lawyer. And then finally, we have Rosalind. She's also from Port-au-Prince. She was pursuing a medical degree in Haiti, which was very uncommon for a woman in the country at the time. She decided to drop out when her mother sponsored her to come to the US in 1983. Her siblings would migrate to the US as well in the years to follow. She became a US citizen after marriage, and although she was unsure about the exact year, she knows that it was during Bill Clinton's presidency. And so based on the interviews and with the study participants, I was able to develop 3 themes in relation to the research questions. The first theme developed in response to the first research question was, I love my home country, but there is more out there. And so this theme described participants experiencing fond remembrances of their home country, utopic ideas of the American dream, and the desire for increased opportunity, as well as family reunification. And so all of these are important, but I think family reunification is something that we can already see just from the description of the study participants. Several of them had parents that were already living in the United States and were living in the United States for a majority of their childhood growing up. And so they were separated from their parents for years on end. And that's a common theme that you see amongst immigrants and migrants who have family overseas or abroad, is that separation for so many years until they're able to petition for their family that's back home and get those green cards or permanent residency for them. The second theme was developed in relation to the second research question, particularly about the part about migrating to the United States. And so when I say migrating to, I'm talking about the actual point of entry. So how did they come to America? And then I'm also talking about their acclimation period. So how did they learn the language? How did they get accustomed to life living in the United States? And so the theme I developed was All That Glitters Isn't Gold. And this theme described class and privilege associated with the ability to migrate. And then it also talked about xenophobia and language barriers as a part of the acclimation process. And then the last theme was taking the good with the bad. And so this was developed in response to the second part of the second research question, where I specifically asked about their experiences living in the United States. And so this theme discussed permanent residence and citizenship, increased educational and job opportunities, as well as more freedom and resources for women and people of the deaf community. And it also talked about the current instability of Haiti. So overall, participants did not leave Haiti because of a lack of pride or affinity, but because of a lack of opportunity, as well as them buying into the myth of the American dream and wanting to reunify with their family. While they acknowledge that the US has offered many educational and job opportunities that would not have otherwise been available, it's not the utopian society that was described to them prior to migrating. And so finally, I will discuss the conclusions of my study. So again, research question number 1 sought to discover what motivates Haitian migrants to relocate to the United States. And based on the responses and experiences of the participants and the outlined themes, I concluded that relocation is motivated by 2 push factors: class status and the historical and current state of Haiti, and 2 pull factors: the American dream and family reunification. And so these are direct quotes from participants. And so a lot of them had accents, and English was not their first language, so it might be a little bit choppy. So to talk about the first push factor, which is class status, while all participants in this study described their upbringing in Haiti as middle class, the only consistent marker of middle class strata that all the participants echoed was a conflation of being middle class and having your basic necessities met. And so this meant access to food every day, having a home to live in, and having some level of access to consistent education, whether that be public or private school. And so the participants saw themselves as different than, for example, the urban domestic laborers that would often work in their homes and who did not have access to education or access to their daily necessities being met. And so this common element that seemed to link my participants to their middle class identity, which again was daily access to what in the United States we would consider basic human necessities like food, shelter, and education, influences their desire to migrate, because they described wanting more than just the basic necessities. They wanted job opportunities, they wanted resources, they wanted opportunity for higher education and to work and to make a life for themselves. And that's just not something that was available to them in Haiti. And so they were describing themselves as middle class as opposed to the domestic laborers who would work in their home. And so to provide context for that, in Haiti and a lot of like third world countries, it's common for middle class families to have a domestic laborer in their home working to cook, clean, and help around the house. You don't have to be like rich or among the highest class to have that. If you're in Haiti and you're living in Port-au-Prince, you might have someone send their child or send someone from their family if they're like living in the country to come live with you, and again, cook and clean and do things around the house. And in return, you would pay them weekly and they could send money back home to their family, or you would put them in school, give them access to education and things like that. And so all of my participants were describing themselves as middle class as opposed to the domestic laborers and like the poorer people that they saw every day. But again, this middle class delineation is what in the United States we would say is just basic necessities being met. And so Samuel said, I came from a privileged family, meaning that I was able to eat whenever I want. I was able to go to Catholic schools. I was a part of the privileged people in Haiti. And so again, this is just an example of how they were calling themselves privileged, but it was a privilege just to have food, shelter, and education. The next push factor was the historical and current state of Haiti. And this is linked to the class element as well, but low employment rates and a lack of job opportunities and resources has made it difficult for Haitian citizens to thrive and truly create a life for themselves. And so Darlene said, back home is different. You could be done and have your degree and still not be able to find work. But here, even though it's not always easy, but you would absolutely find something somewhere to do. So although all the participants described themselves as middle class, ultimately being middle class could not insulate them from the lack of economic opportunity that so many Haitians face due to the stagnation of the economy, corruption of the government, and interference of foreign states. This economic stagnation has created a country where unemployment, regardless of education level, is a norm. And so this motivates Haitians to relocate to the United States for better opportunities. In regards to pull factors, family reunification and ideals of the American dream inspired migration amongst this group as well. Family reunification was greatly discussed, as we talked about earlier. And so Samuel says, my biological mom, I hadn't seen her since she left Haiti in 1971. When I saw her again, it was 1983. That was a long, long time. So yes, that was like a big dream come true for me. I had this grudge that my mom had abandoned me and my sisters. So when I came here, I wanted to see her and ask her why she did that. That was something that I saw echoed amongst other participants as well, feeling like, why aren't my parents here? Why aren't I growing up with my parents? Why are they so far away? I haven't seen my parents in 5, 10 years. And so that feeling of abandonment that is normal for children when you don't understand that your parent is in the United States trying to build a better life for you. In regards to the American dream, the idea that anyone can come to the United States and gain access to fame and fortune and so many opportunities, especially easily, was something that the participants were taught and believed as well. And so Rosalind stated, I was told that America was a land of opportunity. America does great things. If you are in America, you have everything that you need. Money, fame, fortune, all of that. That was America. That was the place to be. So for my second region, my conclusions are in respect to the migrating to part of the question. So again, this is about how they came to be in the United States, and as well as their acclimation period. So learning the language and just becoming acclimated to life in the United States. For my studies specifically, race, gender, and ability did not seem to impact this factor, although historically we can see that they can. The identities that did have an impact in my specific study were class, immigration status, and nationality. So class and immigration status seem to be intertwined and were important to the migration experiences of the participants because they influenced the point of entry and acclimation. Some participants were able to enter the United States legally as green card holders, which allowed for obviously a less complicated point of entry. There are class implications and privileges associated with access to a legal means of entry into the United States. However, others did not have that access. Joseph is one person who did not have that. So he stated, I left school and went home. I found my mother standing at the door with a bag in her hand. She said, today is the day you're going to the United States. It's going to be on a boat. Immigration status greatly impacts the acclimation experience as well, because it severely impacts the opportunities available to migrants upon arrival and adds an additional layer and fear if one is undocumented or underdocumented. And so if you come to the US with a permanent visa or an immigrant visa, then you have proper documentation to work and make a living. However, if you come on a temporary visa, or if you just did illegal entry with like border crossing, you don't have any documentation to work. And so obviously that's going to impact your acclimation period, because it's going to be much harder for you to sustain yourself without proper documentation. And you're going to have to choose jobs and put yourself in situations that normally you might not have. And so again, Joseph came by boat, and so he didn't have documentation to work. And so he said, I found myself working in the field of vegetables in Florida, picking up cucumbers, picking up tomatoes and peppers as a labor worker for $4.25. That never happened to me in my country. That was the worst thing that ever happened to me when I got here. Nationality did impact the migration experience as well. Each of the participants described how xenophobia impacted them in their primary experiences in the United States, whether it was bullying, barriers with language, or work discrimination. And so Ronald said, being Haitian was almost like a curse. They used to laugh at how you dress. If you were in class, they didn't even want to sit next to you. I remember going to high school and the white kids were making fun of my clothes, because at the time when you migrated, you think to bring your best outfit. And my best outfit back in Haiti, it's, I don't even know how to describe that here. It was cultural, but they used to make fun of me. And then finally, my last conclusions were regarding their experiences living in the United States. And so this is post-acclimation. So this is years down the line, once they've learned the language and became accustomed to life in the United States. And I found that all the identities seem to have an impact. And so for class was complicated because on one hand, the dishonesty of the American dream left many Haitians at risk or unprepared for the reality of life in the United States as an adult. They began to learn that the American dream that they were sold was not the reality of life in the United States. And so their dreams weren't achieved as easily as they thought it would be. The capitalist structure of the US requires overworking yourself, low wages, and exploitation. And so each participant described that their opportunity for education, jobs, and success is available. It's very hard to achieve. Emmanuel said, America is the land of trickery. Opportunity only comes to those who know how to get it. You have to lie. You got to trick people to get ahead. That's not the land of the free. That's the land of the opportunist. Fabiola stated, what I have learned in America is that hard work does pay off. So it's not easy, but it's not impossible. So when I was coming here to the United States, I didn't realize I would have to work as hard as I did to be in the position that I'm in, but there's still that path. Nationality continued to affect the lived experiences of the migrants down the line. Xenophobia and ignorance would continue to be an issue throughout their life. And so Rosalind said, I remember there was a march. I was a part of the march. They said Haitians are the one that brought AIDS to America, which is not true. That is ridiculous. All of us Haitians, we did a march to let America know we are not the ones. And so we talked about that earlier, 1990. The march against AIDS and the march with Haitian migrants in Brooklyn against the AIDS designation. She was a part of that. Race impacted their lived experiences as well. They each mentioned that they were not consciously aware of their race in Haiti. And while they were able to track colorism between mulattoes and dark-skinned Haitians, there wasn't any focus on race that they were consciously aware of because everybody was considered Black. And this lack of race consciousness meant that experiencing racism was a shocking reality for them after moving to the United States, once they fully understood the scope of race relations. And so Joseph said, I knew I was Black, but I didn't know what racism was. I know it was just normal to be Black. I didn't know that people would hate me for the color of my skin. I just know that I'm Black. Immigration status was discussed in relation to permanent residence and citizenship. 5 of the participants were citizens currently, 2 were permanent residents, and 1's citizenship status or immigration status was unclear. Samuel was one of the participants who had permanent residence, and he said, actually, I've been living in the United States for at least, like I told you, like 30 years. And guess what? I'm not a citizen. I'm not an American citizen. I was born Haitian and I will remain Haitian. I am proud of being Haitian. The second to last is ability. So ability impacted the lived experience of Esther. She was the female participant who identified as deaf. She described how her quality of life increased as a result of living in the United States. She said, America was great for deaf education, and I had all the equipment for my deafness, and they had everything here. I heard many deaf people had a lot of opportunities there, so that's why I wanted to come. I wanted to see for myself. Life was good. I had everything. I had a video phone here, which I didn't have there. I never had a phone in Haiti. And then lastly is gender. Gender impacts the lived experiences of the migrants, though positively in most cases. The participants described that women in the US had more freedom and opportunities, as many women in Haiti were relegated to being housewives. And so Darlene said, yeah, because here to me, women had more freedom. It's like they could provide for themselves and do for themselves. Whereas back home, if a woman even wanted to buy a pair of shoes, they would have to consult the husband because you're not working, you don't have a job. So it would have to come from the husband. So for me here, there is more freedom. So the findings of my study showed that class status, the political and economic state of Haiti, family reunification, and believing in the American dream inspired Haitians to relocate to the US. Regarding how these identities impacted the lived experiences of the migrants, my findings showed that all of the intersecting identities listed were shown to have an effect on Haitian migrants' experiences either migrating to or living in the United States, though sometimes not both. And so to conclude, according to the Migration Policy Institute, migration and human rights intersect at a number of points, starting when the migrant crosses a frontier, the act that defines international migration. Although migration serves as a form of hopeful escape for many victims of abuse, oppression, and economic stagnation in Black countries, sovereign nations have the right to deny any person from entering their country, irrespective of refugee status or other implications. Nations are marked by borders, and within those borders, governments have a right to determine who may enter and remain in their lands. Grant rights, while international human rights law recognizes the right to leave one's country, there is no corresponding right to enter another country, even for a refugee, without that state's permission. Yet and still, migrants are entitled to human rights irrespective of their documentation status. A migrant entering and remaining in a territory illegally does not negate that country's duty to respect their basic rights under international law. And so Black migrants have a propensity to be especially vulnerable to racism, discrimination, exploitation, and marginalization due to their living and working conditions, their fear of complaining to or interacting with authoritative figures, and they can also experience human rights abuses in detention centers and while experiencing deportation. The US has enacted different policies for different refugees from different countries, and it picks and chooses who may enter the country. But at the end of the day, Black migrants endure trauma that is informed by deeply rooted oppression, and it impacts all facets of their being. My hope is to inspire more equity and justice in US immigration policies. Migration should not only be accessible to those who hold privileged identities. Migration should be accessible to all who want and need it. And that is my presentation. Thank you all so much for your time and attention.
Wow, Brittany, that was amazing. In my own, as unbiased, I'm trying to open my camera here. It's not letting me open. There we go. No? Anyway, there we go. Okay. Brittany, that was absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
It reminded me of, after you've had like a great meal and it's well seasoned and everything, and you go back like a few hours later or the next day and you're like, oh my God, it's so good. It was that.
Thank you.
So proud of you. And before I go any further, I have a note from your other thesis committee member, Dr. Akanyele Umoja, who wanted to convey that he is so proud of you. And when are you going to publish?
Soon. Very soon.
Good. Brittany, that was just so amazing. I want to ask you a question that came to mind, because not often do we have this opportunity to interact with our alumni and their research in this way and share it in the public forum. I'm curious as to your reflections on this now, a year later. What are the lessons you have learned from this study?
That's a great question. I've learned so many lessons. I've learned that, for one, on the most basic level, that everyone has a story. The people that we see, the immigrants that we see who are lawyers and doctors and in these positions, they have struggled a lot to get there, whether it was their own struggle or whether it was the struggle of the generation before them. Just relating it back to my own personal experience, thinking of my grandmother working as a domestic laborer, a maid in the homes of families in New York, and how 2 generations later, I have a master's degree. It took her sacrifice and her story for us to be where we are now. And so the biggest lesson I've learned is that we've all struggled to get where we are. And so you never know what people have been through in order to achieve what they have. And it's just made me look at life more critically. And it has made me more aware of the human rights abuses that happen in front of our eyes every day. If we're looking at the Haitians that were in Del Rio, Texas, and that imagery of Haitians being rounded up by white men on horses, right? Mm-hmm. That permeates our subconscious, and it contributes to this narrative of Haitians or Black people not being deserving of basic human respect. And so those were the 2 things I would say I've learned the most.
Okay. Another question that comes to mind is, and you brought this up when you talked about the Trump administration and their policies. What do you think about the current administration's policies on Haiti?
I would say that while better, it's not enough. It's definitely not what I think a lot of people who may have voted for the current administration were hoping for when they casted their vote. While I acknowledge that things may have been a lot worse under another Trump administration, we had hoped that things would be a lot better under the Biden administration than they currently are. I think that what has happened with the Haitian nationals who have been deported back to Haiti, although we know that Haiti is honestly currently just not livable with the assassination of the president, with the natural disasters that keep occurring. To me, to send migrants back there after they walked for 3 months to cross this border in hopes of finding freedom and safety is inhumane to me personally. And I would have hoped for or expected better from the administration. But I do acknowledge that things would have been worse under President Trump.
Okay. I have another question for you. I'm going to encourage, though, are those in the viewing audience, if you have questions or comments, I do believe you can use the Q&A or the chat feature. Okay, so I see one here in the chat. This is from Stephanie Simeon. And she says, first of all, great job, very insightful. It's inspired to ask a question about my own parents' migrant experience.
Thank you.
Yeah. It really does bring to mind how US history is very centered in itself. We don't get to understand a lot of our own history. I'm curious as to how did your enlightenment come about the Haitian history? Was it through family and stories and experience? Because obviously you have delved deeply into this topic. So how did you learn all of this history?
Growing up, I would always hear my family say, like, Haiti was the first Black republic. Haiti was the first Black nation to gain its independence, but I never really fully understood what that meant or the gravity or how important historically the Haitian Revolution was. I think that it's absurd that I went my entire high school and undergrad until my senior year when I was an African American Studies minor. I went all those years with never learning about the Haitian Revolution, which I would argue is one of the most important revolutions in history, not only because it's the first and potentially the only slave nation to fight against world superpowers and gain its independence, but also because of all the revolutions that were spurred as a result of it. And so that initial education definitely came from my family. I never got that education in school. And then once I entered this program and chose my research topic, I was able to really dive deep into the actual nuances of the history of Haiti, especially in relation to the United States and France, and really delve deep and learn so much more about Haitian history and the beauty of it.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. What you're saying reminds me of an experience I had. It was a couple of years ago on Georgia State's campus, and they invited Isabella Wilkerson, who wrote The Warmth of Other Suns. And she talks about the migration experience of Blacks leaving the South. And I had heard some of those stories, snippets in like African American literature, but mostly through my parents, who both migrated from Louisiana, my father from Louisiana, my mother from Texas. And in reading the book and listening to her put to frame everything, it was almost overwhelming. It was like a validating experience, because you're telling my parents' story. And that's such an amazing thing, because I had not heard those stories in the classroom. Somebody else put a comment in the Q&A. I think it's somebody you know. Great job, Brittany. Proud to have a daughter like you.
Thanks.
I have another question for you from one of your thesis committee members. So let me preface before I get to his comment. I just want to acknowledge the other committee members who did such a fabulous job in collectively guiding this research. Your other committee members were Dr. Umoja Akinyele, who's in the Department of Africana Studies, and Professor Natsu Saito, who is in the College of Law here at Georgia State. So Brittany had some great expertise at her side. So Dr. Umoja Akinyele asked, do you know the common route for most of the folks who were in Texas?
So most of the migrants who were recently in Del Rio, Texas, they did not come directly from Haiti. Those were Haitian migrants that were already living in South America. So like Chile, those types of countries. So they make the walk up from South America, up through Mexico, and then up to the Texas border. And so it's a combination of walking and taking buses if they have money. And if you're looking at the pictures, you see that these people are doing this with whatever they can carry, whatever water they can carry, whatever food they can carry. They're young children, and they're making this 3-month trek to arrive to the United States. And hopefully once they arrive there, they can make some type of asylum claim, or they can be connected with family members. But it's so disheartening to hear about the folks who did make that 3-month trek. And mind you, a lot of these people had not been living in Haiti for the past 10 years since the first earthquake in 2010. So if you make that 3-month trek and arrive to America, to be brought back to Haiti after not living there for the past decade potentially is traumatizing, is dehumanizing. It's so many things. So that's why in a lot of the interviews that you're seeing with the migrants, the Haitian migrants from Del Rio, a lot of them speak Spanish, and a lot of them were speaking Spanish because they had been living in South America for the past few years, potentially the past decade.
Wow.
But the reason that they had all been, another point, the reason why recently they have been trying to travel to America is because of stricter immigration laws in South America. And also in the hopes that because President Biden's administration is here now. They're hoping for more lenient immigration policies that would allow them to stay.
Okay, excellent. Dr. Emoja sent a response saying he so appreciates your response. So
Thank you very much.
you're still impressing your committee. So getting back to actually Dr. Emoja's earlier question in terms of what you're going to do with this in terms of publication or next steps, because I know you at one point you had expressed an interest in pursuing a career in law.
Mhm.
So how does this work or research move you to your next greatest level?
Yes, so I would love to publish this. I have a lot more time on my hands these days, so that's definitely something that I'm actively looking to do. I am also joining this application cycle for law school. I've recently decided, and so I'm in the process of applying to law school. I would like to be a human rights lawyer. And so that is my next steps. I would love to take this research that I've done and try to, I know that it's not possible necessarily to fix the world, but as my other committee member, Dr. Saito, told me, it's more important to make incremental change and help people on a one-on-one level. And so I'm hoping that my work in law can have that type of impact.
He's happy to hear that. So happy to hear that. So in doing this work, we talked about law, I think policy as well, because I know one of your participants in their in your study went on to get her Juris Doctorate and
Mhm.
is practicing, is it immigration law, right? Yeah. I'm curious about your expectation in what wonderful things do you hope to accomplish becoming an immigration attorney?
Yes. So again, kind of like bringing it back to that conversation that me and Professor Saito had, I think that initially it can feel overwhelming when you're seeing everything that's going on in the world, right? Not just with Haitian migrants, but globally, it feels like there are so many things that are going wrong, more so than right. It can feel that way. And so my hope for myself and my career and my legacy is to just have the most impact on a one-to-one level that I can to help the most people that I can, in terms of, if it is with migrants, helping them to achieve asylum status, or helping families who cross the border find proper accommodations, find somewhere to sleep, find somewhere to live, find work, particularly those that are making this trek with small children. I can't imagine what that's like to do that with a child, you know? I just want to be able to use the privilege that I have to make a impactful change, because I have the understanding that had my grandmother not made the sacrifices that she made, that could have easily been me, you know, but it's not. And I'm in a position to help those who are not in a position all the time to help themselves. And so that would be my greatest goals for my career, is to help as many people as I can on a one-to-one level, make as much incremental change that I can, and just try to just do my best.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm reflecting on the words of your father and how proud he is of you. What has this research meant to your family?
I think that it's definitely drawn us closer. I feel like with older generations, sometimes they forget to tell us their stories, or maybe sometimes we don't ask as much as we should. Like, I know sometimes as we get older and we learn more about our grandparents and our parents, it's almost like, who even are you? I didn't know that you went through all this. I didn't know that you experienced all this in life. And so it's definitely brought us closer just to hear about everything that they went through with arriving to the United States and learning the language, finding jobs, and just everything that they had to do to struggle to get to where we are today has deepened my appreciation and gratitude for them, for sure.
Definitely. In listening to your response, it makes me think of sometimes when I'm in the classroom and talking with students about certain historical things that have affected our communities. And we do kind of we don't do a genogram, but I ask them to identify an issue in their family and then trace it back, go identify those people in your lineage and where certain things come from. And invariably, I'm never surprised at how little we know about our immediate history.
Yeah.
And I unfortunately think a lot of it, just my perspective, it comes out of the realizing that these were hard, difficult times. And it's hard for people to talk about these things. But it is so vitally important, I think, to our connection to our family, to our past, to be able to have these stories. And so I can easily see how your research kind of like opens up a door for that kind of conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I'm so glad that it did, because as our grandparents and the elders in our family and our lineage get older, it's so important that these stories don't die with them, especially as the generations of our family continue to be born in the United States. It's like every generation loses a little bit of that culture, just United States, growing up in the United States, being Americanized, as they would say. And so it's important to hear those stories and to pass those stories down so that we never forget who we are, what we've come from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have to say, this is such a full circle moment, because I remember when you walked into my research methods class and you chose a topic. I think it was just for the sake of the class, but I think it was going to be yoga, and I can't remember, but you definitely pivoted and did a 180. So this is a very kind of selfish plug at this moment, but you are one of our alumni presenting, and I want to get your perspective on what you got in the program.
I've learned so much from the program. You're going to learn research methods, so that part can't be skipped. But you just also learn who you are as a scholar. You have so much support within the program to develop those skills, develop your voice, and to really feel confident in your research and what you have to say and what you are bringing to the field of African American studies. And to the diaspora as a whole. I think I'm so glad that I did a master's first, honestly, because I feel so much more confident and so much more intentional about the work that I want to do in my career and in my life moving forward. And so you gain just so many skills about writing, research, but also on a deeper level, scholarship and activism, definitely.
Excellent. Oh my goodness. We're going to have to get you on one of our brochures. Okay. Well, I don't see any more comments or questions in the chat. Do you have anything that we haven't talked about? Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to share in closing with the audience? Oh, wait a minute. There's one more question in the chat. Here it comes. Okay, so this comes from one of our second-year graduate students, Gabriela Ramos. What are your thoughts on media coverage of Haitian situation in both Haiti and the States?
I think that media coverage of Haitians often is dehumanizing, honestly. I think that it focuses on the worst aspects of the island in terms of showing people in poverty and showing people destitute. I don't think that media coverage ever truly chronicles the accomplishments of Haiti, what Haitians in America are accomplishing, even if not on the island. I don't think that media coverage talks about the resilience or the intellect or just the fight that Haitians have. I think that media coverage contributes to why, again, white men on horses can round up Haitians like this is, I don't know, 1860, because we already don't view Haitians as human, kind of in the same way we don't always view Black people as human. You know, there's kind of like that veil of subhumanness that's placed on them when you're constantly being fed dehumanizing images.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's a reoccurring theme when I reflect on some of the students who come through the program, and this issue of who is human always comes up. Yeah. With that said, not seeing any other questions, there is one more comment, also from somebody I think you might know. Mommy is proud of you. So the family is here supporting. That is wonderful. Before I close out, I just want to remind people that the Freedom School is continuing every Wednesday with other presentations. And if you were impressed by this as I am, you will want to come back. Next week, we have our very own Dr. Leah T. Bascom, who will be presenting Finding Home in Coral Islands and Diaspora. And the moderator will be Dr. Lisa Shannon. So do not miss it. Brittany Pradere, I thank you so much for coming back and sharing your work with us and just being a shining example of what it means to go through a program like ours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Davis. I want to give another public thank you to the rest of my committee, Dr. Amoja and Dr. Natsu Saito. Thank you to my family and everyone that attended.
Hey. All right, so with that said, go on. Have the most amazing day. You know, I've been listening to Tabitha Brown. Don't go mess up anybody else's. Bye.